Hello everybody, welcome to this Visuals Crash Course tutorial series. I'm Mario Adam, and today we are going to be starting with routing and topics related to it. Each thing of this series, each little part will build on what comes before it, so it's best not to skip if you're trying to learn this stuff. And I'd also recommend that because this tutorial tends to be a bit more towards the intermediate advanced side, that if you're earnestly trying to learn it and are a newer designer yourself, it's probably better to wait anywhere between a few days and a week to give some things some time to sink in before you move on to the next part. That said, we're going to be kicking it off with some aspects of routing as they relate particularly to visuals and course design. The first main thing that everybody thinks about, or that you want to think about when you're thinking about where to place your golf holes, would be where the greens are located. So first topic is going to be green sites. For that we have a nice little treat here. Jivesinator was kind enough to send me this in-progress version of Pacific Dunes LiDAR. And we're going to be diving into some of this. The first main thing to think about, and this is actually also really nice because Pacific Dunes, for those of you who don't know, was designed by Tom Doak. This little tidbit comes from his book, Anatomy of a Golf Course. And one of the first things he says in his chapter on picking green sites is to think about picking a spot that the eye is naturally drawn to. Let's take the HUD off. And this, right off the bat, sets things up so that the terrain that's there does a good amount of the visual heavy lifting for you. Ideally, it has to play nicely too in the end. It's still a golf course, so visuals are, in a sense, always secondary to playing enjoyment. But for our purposes here, which are visuals, this is what we're going to be taking a look at. So in particular here, we kind of look at the first best example would be hole 3. And if we're just looking at this one, you can see this green is placed between a couple dune faces, and all the terrain and stuff kind of funnels towards this spot. So if you place the green here, a lot of the heavy lifting is already done for you. You've got to put a site that's nice to look at, and you can see from what's around it sitting up a bit, this one, so it will be kind of interesting to play as well. Another general good pointer to think about when placing green sites is that it tends to be best to, or a lot of the time it can work out best to place them in either raised areas or in lower spots, which we will see with holes 6 right here. This is a little tiny green site that sits way up on probably on top of a dune, basically like a natural promontory. So that's a nice appealing spot for a green that kind of gets the player's excitement going. And then you have something opposite like hole 8 where it sits down quite a bit more. And here you have a lot of the surrounding terrain kind of almost up above it, building some framework around the green. So that's a pretty important point to keep in mind. The other thing here that all of these green sites I already showed you have some of going on is that they're all placed in spots where they fit nicely in relation to other land features that are already there. In this case on 3, remember that, you have these dunes off to the left and right of the green, a little hill spot behind to add a bit of visual depth perception to it, just a little something behind. And then 13 here, the green itself is basically placed in the shadow of this dune. And that kind of lends a feeling of completeness to the green site. In addition to here, it's obviously along the coast. This is a very dramatic location for a green on a golf course. So then if you're thinking up high or down low, you can always kind of split that depending on the look you're going for too. This over here would be hole number 10. This one, the green itself actually sits down quite a bit, although you still end up with this very nice infinity ocean view, which, like some other holes you've already seen on this course as a theme here, the green site is kind of located nicely between two dunes, so you have like a little here, a little bit there. That kind of builds some visual framework for this green. So you're kind of focused on this area in here. More specific stuff on that we'll get to later on in the series. And then after that, you can do something similar where you have a low green site with a long infinity vista. You come to hole 15 here. You have a green that's perched up quite a bit, actually. It's more of a tabletop green, almost padded up, like what you would see on a lot of Golden Age courses from Rayner, Tilnagast, Ross, those guys. But here, it doesn't look like it's pushed up so much because you have a lot of dunescape behind it. And this dunescape here is actually way off in the distance. There's not that far, but there's a lot of lower space in here for some paths, get around to different tees and stuff for different holes, transportation between golf holes. But you don't notice it from here. You only see the green, the little bits of dune work, little bits of dunes here, and the stuff behind them, more of this ridge area. So those are a couple things to keep in mind when you're looking for green sites. One more thing, which I think is a little more advanced, would be that a lot of the time, if you're going for a more natural look, you don't want it to feel too symmetrical. Here you can see that you have some smaller hills on the right, and then this stuff's offset maybe slightly to the left, depending on what angle you look from. And if we look back at some other holes, there's 4 here, which is offset towards the left, another cliffside green site, excuse me. And then 13 here, I didn't mention the first time through, that it's kind of set off to the left of the dune. If you try to shove a green set right behind a dune like this, a lot of times it's much harder to make it work visually and it can feel kind of unnatural. We'll get to an example of something like that later on. So those are your general basics with picking green sites at a introductory level. So obviously in terms of routing golf holes, you're not only just looking for green sites, places where an interesting green would be, but you're looking for places where it would be a nice place to tee off from, where you both add some interest, where the land has sufficient interest, or you have some decent hazard placement options in mind, and also where it just looks nice in the case of this series. So in terms of tee sites, I think it's a little bit easier because some of this course tends to be a little bit busy, not necessarily in a bad way. Exit out this way. I think it would be easier to jump over to Cypress Point Club to dig through some of this. So those are some things to look for with green sites. With tee sites, a couple other things on top of the visual to remember. A lot of the time they tend to naturally have some drama and visual interest if they're a little bit high or if they're down low and kind of obscured.
Hello there and welcome to PGA Tour
So with
2K21.
that we see...
My name's John. We've got a par 4 in front of us as we begin. Let's do this. Crank that drive straight at the pipe.
Hole 1 here we can start with. It's a little bit odd in this case because of the hedges, but it's basically a big wide open downhill tee shot overlooking this fairway area. That's a nice way to kick things off and start your round. Hey Scotty, by the way, if you want me to stop for questions at some point, just type something in chat, like literally, and at the end of this section I will stop for questions. So we have that to kick things off, and then we can come over here to hole number 2. And you have this ridge that the fairway sits on top of. And this is one way to add some interest as well. In this case, the tees, notice how they're not just positioned this way. They're turned at a little bit of an angle here. And it's not too much of an angle either. It's just a little bit. What would happen here if you turned it too much? It would still have some visual interest. It might not sit quite as well, but the big downside here is then you start getting into playability. Because every tweak you make to your tee sites, and remember, tee sites are the only place on a golf hole that you have full control over where the player starts from. Though every little bit you change that, the shot from there is going to play a little bit differently. On par 3s, it will vary with hole location as well. But on par 4s, par 5s, very important to keep in mind. So we have this little bit of fairway right here. And one way to look at this is, if we start angling the tee shot more from this right side, you don't really have much of a carry option over here. It's maybe if you want to stay left for a slightly better angle and some pins tucked in this rightmost portion of the green, that's not a big issue. But if we come back to the left, say we go all the way over here, now this would be more of a direct force carry where you're saying, do I have the distance? If yes, you try it. If no, you don't. What happens if you bring it back a little bit in here is the distance, you notice the fairway is kind of also moving out with is kind of also moving out away from the tee box as it progresses down the hole. So this here, maybe it would be, if you can carry 285, you might be able to reach here, whereas you wouldn't necessarily be able to reach this part of the fairway there. That's just a random example. It's not the absolute best example, but it's one that this course has on offer for that. So then another visual thing we have, still on the subject of teeing angles, this par 3 is another good example. Whereas you can take this tee and move it to the right, and you still have a pretty nice visual. It doesn't really fit here with the golf hole itself, or I should say, if you pay attention to the green side and what I said earlier on about a lot of times placing features slightly offset for a little bit more of a natural look. From here, the dunes start to sit more behind the green. Maybe this could still work. Once you start to get over to here, it's kind of, you have to be wanting this look with the dunes sitting directly behind the green. And there's another place later on this course where you have exactly that. It's hole 11. So this is a way to add some variety as well, which we'll get into later on. So here, if you come over to the left, the way the land fits isn't really highlighted by the tee shot placement. So here is approximately where the tees are. Do I have hole numbers in? Yeah. So 4 is another interesting case. This one here. The fairway itself, this tee shot isn't so offset, but this is another thing that I personally have a little bit of an affinity for as a designer, which is to offset the fairway slightly from the line of play. And this adds just a little bit more visual interest. It kind of sweeps to the left and then back to the right towards the green. In this case, the green is also actually centered in the hole itself between here and here. But I wouldn't worry about that so much. It's more just, if you want a little more visual interest, explore different angles offset. You'll end up with completely different results. This look is totally unlike the actual tee shot, whereas this is mostly a little more boring. So to get some interest, always have playing around with those angles in mind. But it doesn't mean you have to have every tee shot offset, because as we can see over here, for hole number 6, excuse the shoddy camera work, this is not offset. This is basically a straight out tee shot visual, just boom. But here, the landing area is a bit obscured. It's got some blindness going on. And the landing area itself pitches rather severely from right to left. So the hole is still following this land, and it adds a lot of difficulty interest as well, figuring out how are you going to try to hold this fairway. So the land still having a sense of movement to it when it's straight is really important. In terms of the ways to get terrain movement into designs and stuff, that's going to be something we get more into in the next portions. So you have that there. And then we keep on going to different places. So here, if we look, the green site sits kind of symmetrically with the dune. So this would be too similar to number 3. But it works because number 7 then sits a little bit offset. And at the same time, the teeing angle, let's see if you go this way, obviously you can't put a tee out there. So your other option with the terrain would be to go up onto the dune. From here, it doesn't sit as nicely. This location has a little more sense of movement in this direction. Plus you can see here, it's sitting more in the dune. And then we come up to 8 here, and this hole uses the dune as the primary feature. Whereas here we have a blind tee shot visual. It's perhaps one of, if not my favorite tee shot visuals in all of golf. It also plays quite nicely too, and it's tricky. It's completely blind, but it's very dramatic. So you're hitting over this dune, and there's other important things about the way this hole is routed as well that we'll get to later on. We're going to make a return to this course later on. That's hole 8. Last but not least, we're going to come over here to hole 12 and have a look at this teeing site. Oops. No, that's 4 tees. This is 12 is here. Sorry, I got lost. So for this hole, this fairway in particular, this hole in general, looks like it doglegs very sharply from left to right. It doesn't actually. If we look at it from above, it's really just that the fairway is offset, and that's creating what looks like a lot of this movement in the hole that isn't quite actually there. And it's just letting the guy follow the hole all the way from left to right. And that's getting a lot of this going on. Plus, if you're actually standing on this tee in real life, just this visual aspect. If you're a golfer who tends to be prone towards letting a daunting visual affect your game, this hole's probably going to get you a bit, because it just feels like things are a lot tighter than they actually are. Whereas in reality, it's not a tough shot at all. You've got probably 50 yards of landing area here. This is about as easy as tee shots will come in general terms. Only if we start looking at things like Cayuma Bay in this game, where B101 had 80, 90, 100-yard fairway widths in some instance, do you really get something that's significantly easier to hit. So remember, tee heights as well, which I didn't mention that much. Actually, I should step back to that for 1 minute. Which is that 8 is kind of low. And there are other places on the course where we start playing around with that. So 10 here, after 9, this tee shot has some interest just by being set up as high as it is off the surrounding terrain. And then 11, which follows, this hole is actually quite downhill. But notice the tee placement is low enough that it doesn't feel like it's a big downhill hole. It feels completely different from 10. Even though the landing area itself might not be that much different, that much less of a height differential than 10 was at all. And from there we have 12 green, 13 is then stacked up on this dune, so you're playing around with the height differential again. That's going to be it on this for now. So remember, tees up high tend to give you a more expansive view. You can use that for dramatic looks. Tees down low, a lot of times you'll be able to obscure different aspects of the golf hole better, and you can use that to create a lot more visual interest than you might think. I'm not saying always put your tees down low or always put them up high. You kind of want to work with what you have. But those are some good general guidelines to keep in mind. And when in doubt, as much as we love to be a slave to visuals, playability is still a little more important. So this next portion might kind of strike you by surprise in that we've already talked about tee sites and we've already talked about green sites, so why on earth would I be talking about both of them at once? Like, we've already covered this. Except in cases where you don't have that much interesting terrain at your disposal. This doesn't happen so frequently in a video game, but in real life it does all the time. In these kinds of cases, a lot of times you have to maximize the features you have by placing tees and greens either on them, near them, or in close proximity to one another, and that is what this is about. So one of the best examples of really tight routing on limited land features has to be Seminole. Just gonna take the HUD off real quick once this loads.
Hi there, welcome back to where we left off last time we were on this course. Time to kick off things here on first hole.
So here we are at another great golf course, but if you notice, this one for the most part is on a really flat piece of land. the vast majority of this is just flat. It's got some water features and not much else. The only real things going on here are you have a little bit of a ridge off to the ocean side of the property, and you have another larger one off on the inland side. And so in these kinds of circumstances, the big thing that makes this course so interesting and great, despite how boring the site is just paying attention to how much the greens and tees were placed in close proximity to each other, but not only that, also using the dune features that are present as much as possible to get the absolute maximum out of this pretty ordinary piece of land. So we come to hole 3. I kind of want to start from the beginning actually and just go through this course. This is going to get a little repetitive, but it will give a pretty good idea. So hole 1 starts down here. The stuff by the clubhouse tends to be the flatter holes. I want to get this out of the way. The only holes on this entire course that have 0 interaction with the dunes are 1, 8, 9, and 10. That's it. Yeah, it's worth the play for sure. What would you expect? Maybe a little rushed in spots, but it's fine. It's definitely worth playing. It's seminal. It's Donald Ross. What else would you expect? But anyway, on with what I was saying. So hole 1 here, you can notice here that you also see all of this hill stuff in the background for this quote-unquote boring hole. There's not a lot going on, but there's more than you would think behind it. And then we start to get into hole 2 over here, and hole 2 is where we start going towards the interesting parts of the land. You have this pretty dramatic tee shot, which is not what you would expect for a quote-unquote flat plot in Florida. Relatively boring piece of land. Hole 3 here then gets arguably even more interesting. So it starts up high, plays a little bit off the ridge, down into the flatter sections, doglegs around, and then the green is back up high. So you're really starting to use as much as you can of the land here. And this hole doesn't look that spectacular, but you have to remember, it's a very boring plot. And then 4 here, the same kind of thing. Sits up high, rides this high part, gives you quite a bit dramatic of a visual, especially on this right side, but also falling away a little bit on the left. Oh, it would have been great as a ring or two, yes. 5 and 6, there's not that much stuff going on. I mean, they're definitely very good golf holes in their own right, but as far as the features go, they're both playing up in the dune stuff. 7 then comes back to the flatlands, teeing off from up high. 8 and 9 are both holes that play down below. But if you notice here, there are other ways to make this hole interesting. You've got some water features and a whole host of different angles going on. The way this green is situated, places the fairway gives you to lay up if you're not going for it in 2, which is really rare in this game. But you get the idea. And then we come to the back 9, and the back 9 really starts to play ping pong off the dunes. So we start with hole 11 here, which is a bit similar to 2, as you might expect. This green, though, sits up even higher in the dune. And the back 9 from here on out just literally plays ping pong off these dunes. So 12 comes down off it, low green site, but you have 13 sitting in the distance to add some nice visual interest here. And then 13, the green reaches the dune shelf on the outer part of the property. 14 plays from the dune on one side of the course back to a green, if I could control the camera better, situated a little bit in the one on the other side of the course. So this hole's also working both into it. 15 then has enough going on, just teeing off from up high. 16 green we can come to over here. There's a little bit built up into this one. And then 17 and 18 are an awesome finish. This green sitting perched up in the sand. And then 18 dramatic tee shot off the left here. And speaking of tee shot visuals with angles for interest, and if you notice how close together these tees are clumped too, mainly because you really have to try to cram things together to get the most out of this plot. The fairway sits off at quite an angle here to the line of play, which not only makes the tee shot more interesting in terms of running out of fairway long as well as figuring out where to hit left, it also gives the whole sense of kind of sweeping this way. Nice trees on 12. I missed that part, unfortunately. But then 18, like 3, also sits back up here. The green site is perched up above with the dune here. And if you look again what I said on the first section about framing greens or having features that are a little bit offset, what do we have here? Instead of a natural feature, we got this clubhouse sitting a little bit offset from the green. Little touches like that can kind of help bring things together. Oh, it was probably on the outskirts of the plot. Anyway, that's all I'm going to spend on this one for now. Just an idea with... This is a much harder concept and one that's not going to come nearly as easily to you. But just to keep in mind, if you really don't have that much to work with, or if you want to make the course feel more cohesive, try to incorporate a lot of the same features as much as you can and in slightly different ways. Whereas 2 green set would be a little lower, 11 would be higher, stuff like that. 16 green set is often that dune but sitting down lower. 17 then tees up high into a similar height, and 18 green is way up top at the end. Stuff like that. That gets a little bit more into the actual routing, more so than the visuals, and that's kind of beyond the scope of what I want to get to in this series for the most part. So now we're going to be going back to... We're going to be returning to Cypress Point, but for something else. Anyway, if any of you watching have some questions now, or jives if there's something you think I dearly missed from what you saw and would like to add something, feel free to go ahead and do so. This is a relatively good place to stop for that, before we kick off the second half. And before you make fun of me for being level 16, at least I have enough to buy the set of irons that I still don't have. And I was 6 under through 10 on Cypress Point, which I know it's not a very tough course, but considering it's me, that's not half bad. You guys about another 30 seconds to a minute just in case. If not, we'll roll on with part 2. In the meantime, I'm going to grab a drink. I would tend to agree with what you just said. I'll read it out loud so if comments aren't available, you can still understand what he said. Which is, a lot of the flatter manufactured courses, especially fictional in this game, don't really do routing justice. And there's definitely some truth to that. Just because it can be hard to make something spectacular enough for a video game out of such a relatively ordinary piece of land. And it's a course that definitely comes through better in real life than it does in this game. All good, Scotty. This stuff is relatively advanced, and that's one reason that I also wanted to try to get the LiDAR tutorial series done first, just to kind of get used to presenting things. Overabundance of fitting land around routing. In this game, you mean? Yes, I would agree 100%. I would add, though, the back 9 of my current fictional work in progress as an example, where this is going to be an aside, and I can also break this up into 2 parts. I'd actually thought about doing that, so I have no qualms with delving off in a little bit here. A lot of you have probably seen this. It's not necessarily anything great, bad, or otherwise. Once it loads, okay. So the routing here, it's very apparent when there's less interesting land movement to begin with. You mean in terms of like when the routing's kind of boring and built, when the lane is built for the routing? I don't know how much you think this course does or doesn't do that. What I did want to say about this course is, as it is right now, basically the entire front nine was, most of the terrain was built around a routing I had drawn on paper, this front nine, and a lot of it's very unfinished. It crosses over here. And the entire back nine was, aside from 10 and 18, essentially ad-libbed. This is very undone at this point, just working along this creek. And these are, 6 is obviously not done. You have 7 here then playing downhill along the creek. 8 then on the little shelf above it, up to a nice skyline green site, when it's done at least. And then 9 is going to be a simple par 3, obviously not finished in this form. And then 10 and 18 here, actually probably 17 too. 10, 17, and 18 are the last of the holes where I had any. Yeah, I see what you mean. These holes here were not meant to be that crazy interesting. And then from there on out, I literally just took what I had with the plot. So this hole, for the most part, was just what I had in mind from the routing. And then it started actually when I found this hole 14 over here, just sitting here waiting to be built. And then I decided to blow up all the back 9 routing that I had down on paper. After that came this hole 11, this blind tee shot here, up and over. And I said, okay, it's official. The only thing here is this hole to me, the way it's kind of crammed in, almost a little bit out of style for this course, feels a little bit like it could have been done on paper. And then 13 here in relation to 14 is kind of boring, but this is kind of just what the land fit. And then you have other stuff here later on. 15 is work in progress, obviously 16 too. And then even 17 was kind of worked a little bit with what was there. Combination of both, I'd say. And then 18, probably a combination of both in its current form. Still a ways to go. But the general idea is you can get there either way in this game, but I would recommend at the very least that you consider some of both. And regardless of what approach you want to take, that you're able to recognize a lot of this stuff. Because no matter what you're doing, whether you're trying to build everything to a preset idea or just take the land in front of you, they'll both end up applying just a little bit differently in the long run. So that's what I would say about that. Yeah, exactly. There have been some really good routings that were completely sketched out on paper, and some really good routings that were completely ad-libbed in this game. You can go either way. I think the real thing with my course, it feels like the front 9 was more conceived ahead of time compared to the back 9, because the front 9 all kind of, consciously built around the creek, and then the back 9, whereas I wanted it to kind of go off on its own a little bit, does so more than I wanted to, and it's kind of like, okay, here's the back 9, now I'm just going to go do whatever. That's what I don't like about it. But that's more from a flow and cohesiveness and that kind of standpoint than it is purely visual. And I'm trying to keep this stuff more towards the visual side of things